This is a seminar that started in November 2023, together with myself and my colleague Malak Labib, aiming to have discussions and invite speakers who have active research in the production of historical knowledge on all periods of Egypt. This is already our second season, the fourth session, and we are very, very Dr. Nadine Atallah, that I really thank her to have accepted our invitation. Dr. Nadine Atallah is a researcher at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, specializing in the Middle East and North Africa. And she's preparing a monograph on the Egyptian artist Ingi Aflatun. And this project was awarded the Fondation Marc de Montalembert Prize in 2023, and was the subject of a scientific mission to the IFAO in 2023 as well. This project is a continuation of her thesis entitled Women, Art and the Nation, les engagements des artistes plasticiennes d'Égypte au mi-temps du XXe siècle. And in this thesis, Nadine Atallah attempts to highlight a series of correlations between the development of modern art, the establishment of an independent nation-state, and the struggle for women's emancipation, all of which flavored the integration of female visual artists into the Egyptian art world. The result of this research is a portrait of a generation of women artists engaged in a social and cultural space marked by the urgency of decolonization and the installation of the Nasserist autocracy. This work has been awarded the Fondation Martine Aublet Thesis Prize and will be published by Presse du Réel. Please join me in welcoming Nadine.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Fatma, for the invitation. I'm really glad to be part of this seminar, and I'm even more happy to do this presentation at the IFAO, which is a very important place for my research. As the IFAO has been supporting my PhD research from the beginning with a grant, and then with the Mission Scientifique on the project about Ingi Aflatun. So it's very meaningful for me to be there tonight. I will talk tonight about the process, the evolution of women's art education in Egypt before the School of Fine Arts in Cairo opened its doors to women. So how did women train while the School of Fine Arts welcomed only male students? That's the focus of this presentation tonight. So when the School of Fine Arts opened in Cairo in 1908, it only trained male students, and women were not allowed to attend. Though there were women among the artists active in Egypt in the first decades of the 20th century. They trained mainly through private tutoring in the harem sometimes, or in the upper class homes, or traveled abroad to attend European schools or academies. These circumstances thus operated as a social filter, since, apart from artists of foreign origin, only Egyptian women from the upper class could afford the expenses associated with a private teacher or trip to Europe. Women from local working class backgrounds or even middle class backgrounds who took up the arts were not numerous. And they included students from feminist-run establishments like the Rod El Farag School, and the ouvroir of the Union Féministe Égyptienne, the Egyptian Feminist Union, although their practices related more to handcrafting and were subject to the imperative of remuneration, like they needed to sell what they produced to make a living. One of the main challenges in opening up the School of Fine Arts to women was therefore to extend access to artistic training, and more specifically to fine arts disciplines such as drawing, painting, sculpture, and engraving, to all categories of the female population. Since 1930, activists from the Egyptian Feminist Union that I will call IFU later in the presentation, have been lobbying the Ministry of Education to allow women to enroll in the fine arts. Beyond the context of the art worlds, the steps taken by IFU to promote artistic training for women relate to the overall development of education for women and girls in Egypt. They follow on from SM Amin's idea that the education of women is a factor in the progress of society and that the arts are a tool for the improvement of society too. Consequently, according to him, teaching the arts to women was part of a step in the development and progress of modern Egypt. The Egyptian Feminist Union's long-term struggle to ensure that women could benefit from institutional and public fine arts training in Egypt was conducted within the broader framework of its many campaigns to improve the education of girls and women. Under the British Protectorate, as a reminder, it lasted from 1914 to 1922. I'm focusing on this period. There were no Egyptian schools for girls. For the less privileged, the only way to get an education was to turn to the religious education provided in the Koteb, or for girls from the middle and upper classes to go to foreign schools, particularly French, British, American, and Italian schools. Consequently, calling for the creation of Egyptian state schools for girls was, as historian Margot Badran explains, simultaneously a feminist and a nationalist demand. One of the main challenges was to limit the impact of Western acculturation, in particular among the elite. I will not get into the details about the history of girls and women access to general education. You can go directly to Margot Badran's book, Feminist Islam and Nation, Gender and the Making of Modern Egypt, and also to Mona Russell's book. Women got the right to attend university in 1929. During the 1930s, universities gradually opened their doors to women, and despite this gradual advance, women remained a minority representing less than 10% of all students in all kinds of universities until the early 1950s. When the Union Féministe Égyptienne made its first demands for women to be admitted to the School of Fine Arts in 1930, co-education was gradually gaining ground in Egyptian universities. So that's the whole context. Between 1927 and 1938, they put forward several requests, which came up against the argument that the presence of young women might cause a scandal, because in the institution there were courses in drawing from live nude models that were taught. So that's an argument that has been used not only in Egypt, but in many countries to prevent women to access schools of fine arts. The efforts of feminists culminated in 1939, when the Fine Arts Educational Institute for Girls was established. I will then get into details about these particular institutions. It was established as the first public institution in Egypt dedicated to art education for young women. It was a partial victory, however, because co-education was not achieved. The institute was in fact reserved for women only, while the doors of the School of Fine Arts remained closed to female applicants. During World War II, many of the foreign women artists who trained young women in the fine arts in their private studios, such as the Greek Flora Talia Caravia and the Italian Amelia da Forno Casonato, who were renowned artists in their countries and moved to Egypt for personal reasons in both cases. They had studios, but during World War II, they left because of the war, and the first one left permanently and the second one temporarily. So during this period, there was the lack of means to learn art for women increased. And on the contrary, Egyptian women artists who were abroad, like Marguerite Nakhla, for instance, an Egyptian artist, were recalled to Egypt to work in government institutions. So as a government institution, the institute endeavored to employ, to hire native teachers, Egyptians, and to train students who came from all classes of the Egyptian society. It was precisely in the period between World War II and the establishment of the Nasserite regime that some of the great names in the history of Egyptian modern art emerged. The first solo exhibitions by, for instance, Tahiyya Halim, Inji Aflatun, Gazbeya Serri, took place in 1944, 1952, and 1953, respectively. These artists also began their careers at a time when the art world was restructuring with the creation of specialized infrastructures and administrations. Taking into account the limitations of available documentation, I attempted actually in my PhD thesis to trace a history of women's access to academic artistic training in Egypt. So I will comment on the evolution of teaching methods in order to better understand the role played by the Institut Pédagogique des Beaux-Arts pour Jeunes Filles, so that's still the same institute I will tell you more about, and then by the Faculty of Fine Arts in Cairo, and later by the Faculty of Fine Arts in Alexandria, in allowing women to become professional artists in Egypt from the 1940s onwards. So in 1939, after a decade of tireless lobbying on the part of the Union Féministe Égyptienne, the Egyptian state created the country's first public institution dedicated to art education of young women, and it was called in Arabic المعهد العالي للفنون الجميلة للمعلمات. Literally, it's the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for female teachers. The original name of the institute was, and its goal was to train female drawing teachers, as the name indicates. And it's also known in other secondary sources as المعهد العالي للفنون الجميلة للبنات. So the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls. It's actually the same institute, and it took me a while to understand that both names referred to only one institution. After many stages of development, the institution gave rise to the Faculty of Fine Arts, the Faculty of Art Education, so كلية التربية الفنية, that still exists today in Zamalek. I was unable to access the archive of this institution, and I couldn't actually be sure if there is any archive, if they could preserve documentation about their activities in the 1930s and 1950s, because they moved several times, so maybe documents were lost. And I relied mainly on the press, newspapers, and on a critical reading of secondary sources that I cross-checked to trace the broad outlines of this institution's history. One of the first teachers of the institute was Zainab Abdou. Zainab Abdou was an artist born in 1903 and dead in 1993. Who wrote about her activities as a teacher and her involvement in the institute. For instance, there's an article in La Revue du Caire, published in 1952, where she says that the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls derived from the Educational Institute for Teacher, which is Mahad al-Muallimat, that was created in 1933 by King Farouk to make up for the lack of female teachers in primary and secondary schools by training young graduates. So in 1938, a class dedicated to learning the fine arts was opened within this institute with the aim of training female drawing and painting teachers. And the following year, the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls, that was located at that time in Giza, became independent. So the drawing section from the teaching institute became independent. and got off to a slow start with only 6 students in 1939-1940, including one famous name who's Sophie Habib Gorgui, born in 1924, and I couldn't establish, her the year she passed away, but I think I have it somewhere. She's best known for having founded a studio school in Harraneya, south of Cairo, with her husband, the architect Ramses Wissa Wassef. So the institute went through several changes, including that it moved to Bulaq, a more central neighborhood. These 2 photographs that you can see on the screen date between 1947 and 1949 and are kept by the family of one artist called Menhat Helmi, who attended the institute. It shows female students at the school. Despite a building deemed unsuitable in the early 1950s due to the growing number of female students, the institute moved to Zamalek only several years later. And in 1966, the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls merged with its equivalent for boys, which was called المعهد للتربية الفنية للمعلمين, giving rise in 1973 to the Faculty of Art Education attached to Helwan University since 1975. From its inception, the Institut Pédagogique des Beaux-Arts pour Jeunes Filles was directed by an Egyptian woman. Her name was Asmat Kamel. She took part in one of the first teaching missions to England, organized by the Egyptian government for young women, as part of a national project to train Egyptian men and women to take on government positions, which were then mainly occupied by British nationals. And it's very remarkable that she was a woman and that she was Egyptian, because the School of Fine Arts in Cairo has been ruled by foreigners for many years before the first director, Egyptian director, Mohamed Neghi, came forward. When the Institut Pédagogique des Beaux-Arts pour Jeunes Filles was founded, the Egyptian women art teachers were brought together to form a teaching team around the rector, who was Asmat Kamel. And together they defined a teaching program. Among the teachers was Zainab Abdo, I already told you about briefly, who played a leading role in the life of the school. A teacher from 1938, she became then head of the fine arts section in 1943, and then rector of the institute from 1947 on, until actually her retirement in 1964. She's known as a watercolorist, and she organized several exhibitions of her work throughout her career. The Museum of Modern Egyptian Art at Dar el-Opera holds a number of her landscapes, and above all, her portraits and female nudes in watercolor and charcoal. Along with Kawkab Youssef El-Assal, who was also known for her watercolors of Egyptian and European landscapes, and in particular Italian landscapes, she was one of the only teachers from the Institute who pursued a career as an artist in addition to her commitment as a teacher. So it was not common to be able to combine a career as a teacher and a career as an artist. This team of Egyptian teachers has been acclaimed in the press and also later in secondary sources as having contributed to Egyptianizing art tuition. So what does it mean? Especially it's important to remind that some artists of foreign origin were also hired by the Ministry of Education, including Emma Kali Ayed, who was an Italian and moved to Egypt with her husband, the painter Raghib Ayed, at the turn of the 1930s, and also an Austrian artist called Lucie Caroline Reiner, who lived in Cairo from 1936 to 1959. And Marguerite Nachla, whom I told you before, returned from Paris during World War II, was also one of the Institute's early teachers. So, despite the fact that there's a whole narrative about how the Institute was very Egyptian and Egyptianized art teaching, there were also females taught abroad who were teaching at the school and foreigners as well. And much more than the beginning of an Egyptianizing or Egyptianization process, what seems very important in the contribution of Ismat Kamel and her colleagues, her teaching team, is how they transformed the teaching methods. They turned their back on the drawing techniques that were used in girls' schools, like, for instance, reproducing a landscape from a postcard by enlarging it. Many 20th century Egyptian female artists recount how they began learning to draw using this method, which was often considered to be boring and to stifle the imagination. While these exercises were offered to young boys in schools, they were not on the syllabus of the School of Fine Arts. They were methods reserved for children and women, and this is one example among other teaching methods. So the Institute's revolution lied in the fact that teachers encouraged students to be inventive and to express their own interpretation of things. Thus, they moved away from an approach to the fine arts as an entertainment and a disciplinary tool to develop the students' capacity for personal expression. They thus offered them the possibility of making the transition from a bourgeois practice of lady artists to that of artists in their own rights. As the Institute's original name suggests, remember it was called the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Women Teachers, it was originally intended to train women drawing teachers. But the curricula evolved, and there's a detail actually of the courses that were given at the school, at the Institute in Sawt al-Fannan, the magazine, and which allowed me to observe the evolution. And teaching became, therefore, it was not seen as a goal in itself, but as a means of earning money to support an artistic practice. And this is an important evolution also. So in this way, Zainab Abdo, the director, who had become director of the Institute, wrote in 1952, and I'm quoting her, "Our aim at this institution is to develop artistic taste and sense, and not just to train teachers. As a result, the works of our former students fill private exhibitions and national museums and are admired by art lovers. These include Gadbeya Serri, Mufida Sha'ban, Nazik Hamdi, Soraya Abdullah Rasoul, I'tidal Hussein, Ikhlas Hussein, and so on." The opening of the Institute, the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls in Cairo, marked a turning point in the history of women artists in Egypt. Thanks to the efforts of teachers who were the first female art teachers trained and hired by the Egyptian government, the Institute underwent a twofold evolution. Firstly, these Egyptian teachers took over from the foreign, and in particular from the British teachers, participating in the movement of reappropriation or to reappropriate public functions on a national level. And secondly, by modifying the teaching methods in the fine arts reserved for young girls, they emphasized creativity rather than imitation, giving their pupils the tools that they needed to claim a career at the same level as male artists. The steady increase in number of female students attests that there was a success, that the Institute's initiative was a success, and contributed to diversify the students' socio-economic profiles. Although I could not establish if tuition fees were applied in this school. Women gained access to the Cairo School of Fine Arts in gradual stages between March 1951 and 1952. The exact date on which co-education became official is not established. It's a process. While I could trace part of this process through mainly newspapers and interviews I could make with artists who attended this process, were actors of this process, I have not been able to find an official decree, for instance, or even a public announcement notifying the decision. It's actually very vague, and I think that the fact that this information is not clearly established and remain vague is meaningful. It means that women's admission to the Cairo School of Fine Arts was not seen as a major event for the Egyptian art world because this art world was already open to gender diversity in some respects, as shown by the presence of women in exhibitions from the very beginning of the Cairo Salon in the 1920s, for instance. At a fairly early stage, there was fertile ground for the admission of women to the School of Fine Arts. This trend was confirmed a few years later by a survey that was published in 1947 in the school's magazine, مجلة فنون الجميلة العليا. It was issued by the students of the school, so the male students. This article reveals the multiplicity of voices, and in particular male voices, who were in favor of co-education. Following a survey of teachers at the School of Fine Arts, including also female teachers from the Institut Pédagogique des Beaux-Arts pour Jeunes Filles, the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls, the students report on the answers that they received, all of which were positive with regards to co-education at the School of Fine Arts. So they highlighted the support of the teaching teams at both institutions, the School of Fine Arts and the Higher Institute for Girls. And the students behind the survey called on the Ministry of Education, I quote, to proceed immediately with the merging of the two institutes without hesitation or restriction. And they put forward the following arguments that I'm quoting. It is no coincidence that we, the students, are featuring this article in the pages of our magazine. It reflects a long period of reflection linked to economic and social circumstances in our country of Egypt. Women have started to emancipate themselves from the constraints imposed by the male nation. But regression keeps re-establishing the chains that have been undone and putting them back in place. While co-education in everyday life is normal, we observe that the Ministry of Education is hesitant, as it allows co-education in some universities and not in others. We wonder what this means. If co-education is not a norm, why is it allowed in some universities? And if it is good to progress, then why ban it? Learning together strengthens the true understanding of democracy. End of quote. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Egyptian society underwent a period of effervescence and transformations. A few months before the end of the conflict, in October 1944, the fall of the Wafdist cabinet of Nahes Besha, who had been brought to power in February 1942 under pressure from the British occupiers, as you know, reshuffled the cards. The anti-colonial struggle accelerated, and workers and popular movements formed as political parties. As a corollary, feminist struggles took on a new dimension in the 1940s. Young people mobilized in major demonstrations, culminating in 1946 with the Abbas Bridge tragedy. To remind briefly the story, in November 1946, a demonstration of mostly male and female students from Cairo University marched to demand an end to British occupation. As they were crossing the Khedive Abbas mobile bridge linking Giza to Cairo, the mechanism was activated on the orders of the Prime Minister, causing the fatal fall of around 20 young people and numerous injured. In 1955, Gazbeya Serri, who was a student of the Higher Institute of Young Girls, made a painting in tribute to the victims of the Abbas Bridge demonstration. And you can see the painting here with its pyramidal composition, dominated by the face of a young woman, highlighting the importance of female participation in this demonstration. And alongside this painting, I also put an image of a painting by Mufida Sha'ban, who was another student of the Institute, and they both graduated the same year and made an exhibition of the graduates. So it was in the context of this social, political, and intellectual ferment where feminist, anti-colonial, and student interests coincided that the students at the School of Fine Arts expressed their demand in 1947. Updating the arguments that were put forward by the Union Féministe Égyptienne in the 1930s, they presented co-education as a factor of progress for society and democracy, i.e., as an ideal alternative to the colonial authoritarianism supported by the royal power. A few years later, the persons who were supporting co-education at the School of Fine Arts won their case, and the decision was taken to transfer female students from the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls to the Royal Faculty of Fine Arts in the spring of 1951, which means in the middle, actually, of the academic year. At that time, the School of Fine Arts had become the Faculty of Fine Arts. So it's also difficult sometimes to retrace the changes of names as well as the changes of locations of all these institutions, but we manage. I tried to trace the first woman who graduated from Cairo's Faculty of Fine Arts. This was difficult. In the absence of archives kept by the faculty, or at least that's what they told me, I systematically analyzed the registers of the Egyptian Syndicate of Plastic Art, نقابة الفنون التشكيلية, going through the registration forms of some 5,000 members, yes, to find artists born before the 1940s. However, it should be borne in mind that the syndicate was created in 1976, which is late, which means that artists who stopped working or died before that date are not included in the list, in addition to those who, for whatever reason, decided not to join the syndicate. So the data collected this way is incomplete. Anyway, the earliest member of the union who graduated from the Faculty of Fine Arts in Cairo is someone called Fawziya El Atafi Sonobol. That's her on your right. And sorry? Can I? Oh, yes, I can. But the quality is not excellent. Anyway, you can find it online. I put the link on the bottom. No, we don't want the schedule. Here we go again. So that's her. The date given for her graduation is 1952. Which suggests that she was one of the students from the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls who graduated by equivalence, who joined in the spring 1951. Although we don't know much about that woman, actually nothing else than what's on the screen, we know that she was born in Alexandria, that she wears the hijab on her identity photograph, which is actually quite rare for women artists from this generation. And she also regularly took part in exhibitions between the 1960s and 1980s, notably in the USSR, where she continued her studies in 1971. From 1952 onwards, I could find more evidence of women's presence at the Faculty of Fine Arts in Cairo. There's an article published in Musawwar in 1953 that states that there were 50 Egyptian women students at the time. Yes, here is another woman artist that I found in the registers of the syndicate, Rawhaya Tawfiq. And I was pleased enough to see one of her artworks at the Museum of Fine Arts in Alexandria and to make the connection with her name in the registers. She had a beautiful career that you can check on the register online, but more not as an artist, but as a culture agent. So that's the article I was telling you about from Musawwar, stating that there were 50 Egyptian women students at the Faculty of Fine Arts that year. And in the photographs, we can see the students at work in the workshops at the faculty. Some were drawing in front of a pharaonic plaster bust, and several are sketching a female nude on paper or also in sculpture. The model remains out of the frame of the photograph, and but this allows us to establish that nude model sessions were held at the Fine Arts School, and this was the case until 1981. But we have a specialist in the room who can answer your questions about it, about this topic. The fact that the faculty had become co-educational, including in the access to nude model classes, did not prevent young women from encountering difficulties. For example, there's a student called Qadriya Hussein, who was one of the faculty's first female students, and she saw her graduation project rejected as obscene when she presented her diploma for the first time in 1953. For her graduation, she spent time in a psychiatric hospital, and she painted a series of portraits of mental patients, revealing sometimes uncovered parts of their bodies. Here are some comments that were published in newspapers about this graduation project. I'm quoting. Qadriya got completely wild. And it's not surprising that the teachers rejected her project when she submitted it for her graduation, because it was so realistic, more than necessary, and more than can be accepted by tradition. Qadriya did not despair, however, and did not consider changing her project's topic either. She returned to the hospital, wandering among the patients, and covered the bare legs and protruding breasts on her canvases, in order to please the teachers and to please traditions. When she presented her project this year, the teachers gave her first-class honors. So it was after resigning to self-censorship that Qadriya Hussein graduated in 1944, while her male colleague, Sabri Raghib, who's a famous artist and graduated the same year, was unanimously acclaimed for a project entitled Banat el-Leil, Girls of the Night, including 12 portraits of prostitutes, which apparently no one considered contrary to morality or tradition. Unlike Raghib, who became a well-known portraitist, Hossein does not seem to have made a career for herself. By the way, she is not to be confused with the princess, the granddaughter of Ismail Besha, who had the same name. In this respect, the number of women who graduated from the faculty during the 1950s and attested to continuous professional practice as visual artists up to the 1970s is very limited. In the Fine Arts Syndicate's records, I could find only 5 of them, including some big names such as Mariam Abdel Alim, who graduated in 1954, Fatma Arargi, who graduated in 1955, and Zenab El-Seguini, who graduated in 1956. One reason why social diversification among women artists was so slow is that while tuition was free when the School of Fine Arts was first established in 1908 and then only open to men, school fees were introduced in 1957, a few years after women were admitted. Actually, in the 1950s, young women from working class backgrounds did not see the fine arts or could not see the fine arts as a potential trigger of social mobility, whereas male applicants from all social backgrounds flocked to the 1908 entrance exam as the Faculty of Fine Arts was free, and these students, these male applicants, were attracted above all by the free tuition. So forced to maintain a stable job and income, disadvantaged women who trained in the fine arts generally did so in their spare time, in particular at popular universities. In 1958, the Institution of Popular Culture, مؤسسات الثقافة الشعبية, which had several branches in Cairo, had an impressive 6,300 women students who came, I'm quoting, to learn the fine arts, from painting and sculpture to handbag making and tablecloth embroidery, or to print fabrics of all kinds. End of quote. In other words, these were new occupations that were financially and intellectually useful for them, in the words of the director of the Institution of Popular Culture, Mohamed Mohyeddin. As for other regions of Egypt, when the Faculty of Fine Arts opened in Alexandria in October 1957, it naturally welcomed girls and boys among the students, since the struggle had been won in the capital. In addition to the new or newly co-educational institutions, the Higher Institute of Fine Arts for Girls continued to train women not only to become teachers, but also to enter the art profession. From the second half of the 1950s onwards, there was a gradual increase in the number of female students in public higher education, to the point that by the 2000s, they composed more than 85% of graduates from the fine arts faculties of Cairo, Alexandria, Emilia, and Luxor combined. However, not all female graduates of these courses became visual artists. Some chose